Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair for bearing with us with the technical difficulties. Inshallah, we're going to go ahead and begin. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. The alarms are blaring once again in Al-Quds. On the news, Facebook, Instagram, stories are once again flashing about the latest Israeli aggression. Their soldiers have trampled into Masjid al-Aqsa. The prayers are suspended. Women and children are being manhandled by armored and armed Israeli forces and settlers. Their tongues dare insult Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Homes are being demolished. Tears and tear gas are flowing in the streets. Jerusalem has been declared the capital of Israel and recognized by the nations. All of this because of the Holy Land. All of this because of Al-Quds. Now, this is a scene we are well accustomed to growing up. Seeing the scenes of Muslims oppressed. The world and its powers sitting completely unmoved. Deep sadness and protest from the Ummah. And then the same thing over and over again on repeat. This is the reality we live in, and as we discussed last time, it is the world we are told to accept and conform to. We are told to dream not of other worlds. And this, brothers and sisters, is why we are having the series on Al-Quds. It is to remember who we are. It is to remember how we got here, and finally to be able to connect our reality with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His deen, so that we can change our reality and not merely submit to it, so that we may understand why Al-Quds is the way it is today, and so that we can feel free to dream and work for another world. In ayah 19 of Surah Hashr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ولا تكونوا كالذين نسوا الله فأنساهم أنفسهم أولئك هم الفاسقون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the translation of the meaning, do not be like those who forgot Allah, so He made them forget themselves. Those are the sinners. So for some of you brothers joining us, this is kind of the multiple iteration of this series, right? And a couple of things I want to make clear as we go forward is, feel free to, chime in. This is something I've researched. I think I've kind of enjoyed understanding this. But if you have something to add, and if you have something that's relevant, feel free to share. And likewise, if there's anything that's unclear or question, feel free to jump in. And for sure, afterwards, we'll have a kind of deeper question and answer session as well. So before we kind of jump into today's session, I wanted to kind of just quickly take a step back, right? So previously, we went over in detail the history of Bani Israel and their relation with Al-Quds, as well as their claim of it being their promised land. And we found the following conclusions. We found that, yes, the land of Al-Quds, the land of Jerusalem, was promised by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to Bani Israel, but under the following conditions. That firstly, that authority is conditional on taqwa and obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we look through the history, we found that Bani Israel only had authority when they were obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and when specifically they were being ruled and under their prophets. The peak of their history, as we discussed previously, was under Dawud alayhi Islam. We also found that Bani Israel disobeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They played games with His hukam, with His commands, they rejected, mocked, and even at times killed his prophets. And we found that because of their crimes, they were banished from Jerusalem many times. First by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He forbade them from entering Jerusalem initially. And then subsequently by the superpowers or the powers that be, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Romans, Persians again, the Christians, etc. And we found out that after rejecting Isa alayhi salam and after rejecting Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Bani Israel has no more prophets, because obviously after Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam there are no more prophets. And as we kind of discussed last time, what that really meant for them, and even for us, is that essentially they are an ummah, a people that are leaderless, and they'll have no more prophets after them. I mean, just to remind you of what we're talking about, right? That hadith we talked about in the beginning, right? Just to keep in our minds. Anyone recall vaguely kind of what that was?
About the prophets ruling, and then after that, the prophets.
Absolutely, yeah. So the hadith is narrated by Abu Hurairah, where the Prophet ﷺ said that Bani Israel used to be ruled and guided by the prophets. Whenever a prophet died, another would take over his place. And then he continues, there will be no prophet after me, but there will be Khilafah who will increase in number. And then the people asked, "O Allah's Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what do you order us to do?" He said, "Obey the one who will be given the Pledge of Allegiance first, fulfill their rights, for Allah will ask them about any shortcomings in ruling those Allah has put under their guardianship." Again, right? So going back to that point, since there will be no more prophets, Bani Israel was ruled directly by the prophets. Since there will be no prophets, there are people that are leaderless. And as we found out with the history, once they went away from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, once they rejected His signs, once they rejected His prophets, this is exactly what happened. They were a people that could not manifest their own destiny. They were a people that were flung by the powers that be, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Romans, etc. And there were people that were truly in a rejected and a wretched state. These are principles, as we've discussed before, we need to keep in mind as we get closer now, finally, into the modern world. And we found that one of the questions we raised in the beginning, and I think inshallah we will finally sort of kind of get to the meat of that today. I don't think we're going to finish the history because it is a bit extensive, but one of the questions that was posed in the beginning, right, and some of the brothers had was, okay, look, I agree. So we went over the history. It's clear. Bani Israel were a people that were leaderless, a people that were destroyed, pushed by the powers to be. They were always working under the superpowers, the Persians, the Romans, etc. They were people that could not manifest their destiny. If that is the case, how does that exactly match up with the scene that we described in the beginning, where they are marching with their soldiers in Masjid al-Aqsa, where they have their knees on the necks of the Muslims, where they're arresting children, and we see the state of the world, it is the way it is. Inshallah, today we'll get closer to that, right? So moving forward, after we talked about Bani Israel, we moved on to the Muslim period and found that since the Muslims conquered Al-Quds peacefully under the second Khalifa Umar ibn al-Khattab, the Muslims had Al-Quds, and generally speaking, it was a time of tolerance and peace that is in many ways unimaginable today. We talked about the Crusades, which occurred when the Muslims were divided, and about the occupation of Al-Quds by the murderous Crusaders that lasted for 86 years. Before finally being reconquered by Salahuddin, we continued towards the rise of the Mamluks and their custody of Al-Quds, and that sort of culminated in the rise of the Uthmani Khilafah and the peaceful takeover of Al-Quds by Salam I. Now, this is kind of the scene that we sort of left off on last time, and this is inshallah where we're going to start our journey today. Now, there are a couple of really important frameworks we're going to need to go into of what was a transition exactly, and I think we're going to get into it. So before kind of moving forward, I just wanted to kind of open the floor here. I know there are a couple of new brothers here as well. Do you guys have any questions? Anything that was unclear, or just something maybe you want to be expanded before we move forward into the Ottomani period and beyond? Clear. Okay. Okay. Moving forward. So we went over the Muslim history, right? That just as the Hadith described, right, that the Muslim Ummah was ruled by Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and after that by subsequent Khilafah, from Umar ibn al-Khattab or from Abu Bakr, Umar, etc., etc., and their relation to Al-Quds, how they supported it, how they paid honor to it, how it became the center of many things. And finally, now we're going to the Uthmani period, right? Now, is everyone here know who the Uthmanis were? Anyone not? Actually, maybe that's a better question. Does anyone not know who the Uthmanis are? Yeah. Okay. So, I'm actually glad you said that, right? Because just as a bit of a side note, I think most of us, right, as we grow up kind of in the West and as we're learning, we are really disconnected from history. Even if we're from back home, let's say Pakistan or other areas, Iraq, etc. Like, you only learn the history of your specific state, right? And actually, the first time I actually heard about the Ottomans, or in English we call them the Ottomans, was actually back in elementary school. Just as a side note. Elementary school, yeah, not preschool. And it was actually at the same time we're learning a little bit about German history. As they do a quick page here and there. So we're learning about Hans Otto on one side of the automobile and the auto engine and cycle or whatever. And on the next page, as far as I remember, it was about the Ottomans. And back in those days, I thought the Ottomans were Germans, and this is about German people. And it wasn't until I was all the way in high school where I was like, wait, the Ottomans, the Uthmanis, they are the Muslims. They are our people. How come we've never really heard about them? So just to kind of get back to your question exactly. So the Ottomans were the last Khilafah of the Muslims. It was under the last Khalifa. Basically, it was the last rulership of the Muslims, where the Muslims were ruled by the Quran and Sunnah, and they pledged allegiance to the Khalifa, and the Khalifa had authority over the Ummah, right? And again, as we covered in the Muslim history really briefly, that doesn't mean everything was perfect. At the end of the day, we're humans, and of course there's mistakes and issues in the Muslim history, but it was the last authoritative body of the Muslims. Okay, so they ruled for about 600 years, right? And we're going to go into starting from the 1800s. So in Iran, in the early 1800s, the Zionist movement, which was actually the movement for the reclaiming the promised land of Jerusalem for the Jews, the Zionist movement started to emerge. And in the early 1800s, they began immigrating to Palestine. And that's when we saw sort of a rise of the Jewish population from 25,000 to about 90,000 inhabitants. Now, just to keep that in mind, in comparison, by 1914, about that time when there was about 90,000 Jews present, there's about 450,000 Arab Muslims, the Palestinians. Now we're going to inch a little bit closer. 1891. So I mean, there is, like I said, a lot of things to cover right now, but what I want to do today is kind of build a little bit of framework, and we're going to go back into these things maybe inshallah in more detail. So the Zionist movement, keep that in your mind. So 1891, what happens? The Arabs in Jerusalem actually appealed to the Uthmani Khilafah about this massive immigration that's going on. Okay, 1896. Theodore Herzl, the Zionist, I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with this if you're following some of the things that are out there. writes about the revival of the Jewish state in Palestine, and he goes and petitions the Khalifa of the Muslims himself, Abdul Hamid II. And he petitions him because in this time period, the Muslims were in debt. Although they had authority, although they were kind of combating various states all around them, the Europeans putting them in check, the French, etc., fighting the Russians on one side, the Europeans on the other. As they were doing all these things, they were in a lot of military debt. So the Zionist guy, he approaches the Khalifa and he offers him, we will take care of your debts. We will take care of your things that are going. All we want in exchange for this is this huge sum of money is Al-Quds, is Jerusalem. And as I'm sure you've heard many other responses, so he writes back to them and he says, tell those, in this translation at least, tell those impolite Jews that the debts of the Ottoman state are not a shame. France has debts and that does not affect it. Jerusalem became part of the Islamic land when Umar ibn al-Khattab took the city, and I am not going to carry the historical shame of selling the Holy Lands to the Jews and betraying the responsibility and trust of my people. May the Jews keep their money. The Ottomans will not hide in castles built with money of the enemies of Islam. So he denies the approach of the Zionists. Now we move forward, and I think many of you guys are familiar with this history as we move forward. 1916 rolls by. This is when the Sykes-Picot Agreement is first drafted, whereby the two countries, namely Britain and France, make a proposal of carving up the Middle East in terms of spheres of influence. The French would be given control of the modern Syria and Lebanon. Most of Palestine was to be given to the British, etc. So there's a plan being concocted at this point. 1917. James Balfour of the British Foreign Office leads a reform, a declaration, is infamously referred to as the Balfour Declaration. Now, this is a declaration which declares that it has been passed in the House, the chambers, etc., that the sympathy with the Jewish aspirations which has been submitted to and which has been approved by the cabinet. So this is in the British system. The Balfour Declaration has been approved in 1917. All a precursor of what is to come. Again, lots of detail, but we're just going to keep kind of moving forward at this point. 1919, Faisal Hussein, the son of Sharif Hussein, meets with the British, making an agreement with them and working against the Uthmani Khilafah. 1920, there's a conference in San Remo, Britain. San Remo, Britain and France set up mandates over former Khilafah wilayas. Syria and Lebanon were mandated to France, Palestine to Britain. Again, all theoretical at this point. March 3rd, 1924. Now, this is a date to remember. I know some brothers know this, but anyone not aware of what occurred on March 3rd, 1924? Okay, couple of brothers. All right. Anyone want to give it a shot that might have a little bit about the background?
The abolition of the Khilafah.
March 3rd, 1924 is the date. It is maybe, I would say, the most pivotal date in the last 100 years in terms of the Muslim Ummah. And as the brother said, March 3rd, 1924 was the date when in Istanbul, in the seat of the last authority of the Muslims in the last Khilafah, that Mustafa Kemal, after World War One, in their ruling body, basically abolished the Khilafah. Let me take a step back. Why were the Uthmanis pushed to the state? After World War One, I'm sure you guys are aware, this is something we cover for sure. World War One was the war between what and what? Central Powers and the Allies. Right? Who won? The Allied powers. Now, were you guys aware that the Muslims fought or were involved in World War One? They sided with the Germans. Anybody else? Maybe not, right? Okay. So the Ottomans were part of the losing side in World War One. Now, a lot of these plans were being, as we kind of discussed, put into place before then. Actually, hundreds of years before then. Nevertheless, right? So March 3rd, 1924 was when officially the last remaining Khilafah of the Muslims was abolished. Do you guys know the last time this happened?
Before that?
Before that.
Never.
Well, you said never, but actually, okay, so I'll put it this way. So the Khilafah as an institution of the Muslims since Abu Bakr as-Siddiq has continued on in various forms or shapes. And never has there been a time when the institution has been completely absent. There was a brief period when there was no Khalifa amongst the Muslims. And that was during the time of the Mongols. So the Mongols invaded and basically destroyed, pillaged every land they encountered. And they came into contact, as we kind of discussed briefly before, with the Khilafah in Baghdad at that time, in Egypt. And they ransacked the city. They took the Khalifa out and, they brutally murdered the Khalifa outside of his own city as the city was burning, right? And there's this, say it again? In Iraq, sorry, yes, in Iraq, in Baghdad, Iraq. And as the city is burning, they took the Khalifa out and they murdered him in cold blood. And do you know how long there was no 3 years? Yes. I remember this from last time. Yes, very good. So the Khalifa was absent from the Muslims for 3 years, and in this time, the Muslims were going crazy. This is unprecedented. Never happened before. The scholars, the people, basically the ummah is burning. This is a crazy situation. How can we organize the armies? How can we conduct the salah? How can we do so many things? Unprecedented in terms of fiqh, in terms of all these things that are going on. But alhamdulillah, in 3 years, things were recouped, put back together, and the ummah moved forward. The ummah defeated the Mongols. Many of the Mongols converted to Islam. Things moved forward, right? Because the institution itself was still in place. We, starting March 3rd, 1924, we are at a very unprecedented situation in the state of the Ummah. This is high alert. This is a state of emergency. We have been in a state of emergency for like 97 years, 100 Hijri years, actually. I want us to kind of keep this in mind going forward, right? And we remember the Hadith, right? Putting that into perspective. So essentially for 100 years, we have been leaderless. So what did we find happens to an ummah that has been sent by Allah, where they don't have prophets amongst them and they don't have the successors to the prophets, or what happens to an ummah that's essentially leaderless? Fragmented, bounced wrong, lost, ping-ponged, oppressed, made worthless, killed, expelled from their homes. Those were all the references from Bani Israel. But Who does that sound like today? The Muslim Ummah, right? Just keep this in the back of your mind. Inshallah, I mean, we'll get into this a little bit further, but this is an extremely pivotal part in this. But let's keep moving forward. 1936. At this point, a lot of the Jews are being pumped into the Palestinian area by the British, right? By the British, they control the area now. So 1936, the Muslims of Palestine hold a 6-month general strike and protest against the confiscation of their land and Jewish immigration. It was one of the longest strikes of its kind ever. The strike paralyzed the transportation, economy, and production of the state, and the British had to see sort of what was going on. But still, no change in the situation exactly. 1937. The British Royal Commission, headed by, the British, they petitioned that Palestine, it should be divided into an Arab state, a Jewish state, and an international protectorate. Moving forward. 1939. Another strike occurs by the Palestinians, more resistance. Now, these strikes are just kind of, we're not going to go again into the deep details here at the moment. We could maybe later on. But I want to mention these strikes because there is sometimes an idea that the Muslims were kind of passive. Like they've always been on the receiving end. But I mean, Muslims never give up. If you look at our history, like there's people like that. There's people like we discussed in the first talk that are never ready for the fight, like Bani Israel, right? Bani Israel were rescued by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Musa alayhi salam from the clutches of Fir'aun, and before their eyes, they saw Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala split the sea, and they saw Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroy Fir'aun and his army with their eyes. And yet, when they were commanded to approach the people of that inhabited Al-Quds at that time, they told Musa alayhi salam, "You and your Lord go." Right? So there are people like that. There are ummahs like that. But alhamdulillah, the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, no matter what state it is in, they have that in them, that fight, that resistance, that will to live, right? So even in that state, the Muslims of Palestine, they resisted. Anyways, moving forward. 1944 to 1947, the settlers from the Jewish side start doing a lot of clandestine actions. And what I mean by that is they started what we would call in today's terms, I mean, they are a terrorist nation, but they started actually doing terrorist operations against the British, blowing up their hotels, doing a couple of things, and it's kind of funny, those exact same guys ended up becoming the prime ministers of Israel as it became an entity. Again, we'll kind of keep it at that for now. World War II occurs. There's a big shift in global power, right? We saw who the winners were after World War I. It was the Allied powers, and specifically we saw the British and French divide up the Muslim world, right? According to that plan they created before the Sykes-Picot Agreement. World War II occurs, and the balance of power is split. Europe is destroyed. Who comes in next? The Americans, right? In May 14, 1948, the British mandate over Palestine expires, and the Jewish National Council declares the establishment of Israel. The so-called armies of the Muslims react at that point, but we're gonna, I think, keep it at that for now. All right. Couple of things have occurred, right? Couple of pivotal moments that I want to kind of touch up on right now, right? So we talked about there's an extremely important framework of the last century. The hadith that we've kept kind of reiterating as we've gone through the series is that, Bani Israel were ruled by the prophets, but after Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there will be no more prophets. But after that, there will be Khilafah, and the order we've been given by Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is to give pledge to them. Now, what happens when there is no more Khilafah, right? We talked about as the example before us of the previous nation, when they are leaderless, they become ping pong. They become basically desecrated. We kind of hit this earlier, but does this answer your question? So the question was, okay, we saw the history of Bani Israel. How are they in the state they're in right now? The direct answer to that question is, as we kind of seen briefly in the history, we haven't even gone into like much of the details, but as we've seen, they were actually exported from Europe, from various parts of the world to Palestine with the help of the superpower of the time, which was at the time the British. Again, you know, they're not manifesting their destiny themselves. They have been moved. And this is what powers do. This is what thinking people do. This is what people that control their destiny do. They either create events or they react to them. So the British saw an opportunity here that the Uthmani Khilafah has been defeated militarily. The traitor amongst the Uthmanis, Mustafa Kemal himself, has abolished the institution of the Khilafah. And then they started exporting the Jews to Palestine. Why? Any ideas? Is it because they love them?
No, in fact, some of the people that were the architects of this entire thing were some of the biggest anti-Semites that were there. And if you want to understand kind of how it works, like think of the Ummah the way that it is right now, like how they pretend to be our friends as they make decisions for us, but we can clearly see that they're enemies. Like, for example, the US president might do something in parts of the Middle East, might do like some initiative, but we know all the other factors that are playing in, that it's not out of good faith. Just like that, these guys that were the biggest Zionists, they were also the biggest anti-Semites. They hated the Jews. They wanted that problem out of Europe.
Yeah, okay. So just to reiterate for the audience that might be here, that was actually a great point. The brother said that the architects of this policy, the British, the Americans, etc., behind the scenes, they were some of the biggest anti-Semites, quote unquote anti-Semites that we know. They actually hated the Jews. They actually wanted to, they literally oppressed them. They literally put them in chambers. They literally did, these horrible things, and they wanted them out of their countries. There's actually a very interesting quote from Benjamin Franklin. I'll get it for you guys next time. But he basically iterated some of the same sentiments. So they actually hated these people. So would they want to fulfill their dream? Would they want to give them their dream? Would they want to make their hopes and wishes happen? No, right? Of course not. They had something else behind the scenes of why they did it. Strategic interest, right? Another important things to keep in mind is that people, and specifically nations, they do things for their interests, right? So the British originally, they allowed this project to happen because, one, it allowed for them to create an alien body between the Muslims in the region, which would hinder their continuity and distance their unity. You want to keep people divided? Well, first, create some artificial constructs, nation state, borders. Number one. Okay, number two, put an alien body in their midst. Why? Because number two, so they stay preoccupied. So the region stays, they preoccupied the region with struggle with the Jews, and made them forget their original struggle with the West, right? Which was what destroyed the Khilafah. So before the Jews were helped to have a stay in Palestine, struggle was between Muslims and the West. After the Jewish occupation of Palestine, the struggle in the Muslim minds shifted to usurping this entity that came in and occupied, right? So it keeps the people kind of distracted away from who's actually holding kind of the strings in the back. And third, as the brother has kind of mentioned, is because they wanted to get rid of the problem of, the Jewish state, basically the Jews in their own lands. They found, based on their history, that wherever the Jews are present, and again, this goes with the quote of Benjamin Franklin, which inshallah I'll get next time, Benjamin Franklin is that they wanted to get rid of their problem. They wanted to get rid of the corruption and cheating, and usually that would follow the Jewish people. So it was strategic interest that it fulfilled for them. Now, who's the current president of the United States? Sleepy Joe. Very good. That's the correct response, Sleepy Joe. So Sleepy Joe Biden, he's the current elect president of the United States of America, right? And I'll leave on this. His address to the Senate in 1987. Now, I didn't have a chance to get this as a quote straight down, but basically he says to the Senate amongst them. Now, it looks like he's falling asleep like most of the time, but in 1987, I don't know what he was doing, but he was pretty passionate at that time. He got up in Senate, he's wearing a suit, and he says that we should not be ashamed at our support for Israel, right? As we are, as most of us do support it. He said that, if Israel didn't exist, we would create another one. He said, Israel is the best investment that we have made. He's like, it's the best $3 billion we've spent. I want to kind of leave this session on that, but think about that for a second. There's this mythos, around us as we grow up, as we're, going to iftars, as we're going to dinners, alhamdulillah, as we're talking with some of our elders. There is this idea we've hit many times before, we've encountered maybe in the MSAs, masjid, etc., that quote unquote the Jews rule the world, right? Now we've seen from the history, it's not true. We've seen from the history of the Muslims, that's not true. Now we're hearing it from Sleepy Joe himself that this is their best investment, and if it did not exist, they would create another one. Why? Because it fulfills certain strategic goals. Now, we're not going to get into detail of that right now. Inshallah, that'll be continued later. But again, I want to kind of emphasize that point. As Muslims, as people who fear Allah, who love Allah, and inshallah want the pleasure of Allah, why are we discussing this? Do we love history? No, we don't actually. I mean, it's not something we're doing for fun, right? And history is not something even we model our behavior after, but we want to be able to look beyond our reality, see how things came about, and be Muslims like how the prophets were, who shaped their reality. They did not make their reality, their source of doing everything. No, what they did is they took what Allah SWT said, and they changed their societies, their families, their tribes, their nations based on what Allah brought. So that is why we're looking at history, so we can remember who we are. As the ayah in Surah Hashr that we started off with, so we can remember Allah and we can remember ourselves, and we can continue being the Ummah of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam as it should be. So inshallah, I mean, we glossed over a lot of details. We can kind of continue into the question and answer. Inshallah, as we kind of move forward, we will get into more details. Okay, what is going on in the current reality? Why do the powers that be do what they do? What exactly are those strategic benefits that they're getting? What are the motives? I hear news from here and there. It's confusing. How do we put that together? What is really going on? So inshallah, some of those questions will be addressed as we move forward. So Eid is coming up, so most likely we may not be meeting next week, but inshallah we'll keep you guys posted. So at this point, we will inshallah take off the live stream and continue to a discussion. And for the people watching, you can leave comments and we can kind of address that there. And you're more than welcome to come in person, and we can continue this discussion as we've been doing with some brothers.